Hi everyone. Again, it's our second meeting it's the second meeting of the online research seminar gameplay studies criticism design, and the topic of this meeting is religion and video games. And the keynote speaker for today, the keynote talk, will be given by Lars de Wildt, who is right here in this meeting with us and waiting while I'm giving him a word. And yes, the talk is called "Where is your God now?" Oh, they are in video games. So Lars, please, you have 1 hour in general, and so you may share you may use your time as you want for the talk itself and Q&A section.
Thank you. First of all, just want to quickly check if this is working for you. Do you just see the slides or the other stuff as well? That's great. Right, so yeah, just quickly about the title. Of course, the question, where's your God now, comes from a presumption that is mostly, I think, Western, that happens in sociology over the last 150 years, and that happens in a specifically European and European settler descendant context, right? Which is the question, where did God go? Why did people leave the churches? Why do increasingly people in surveys indicate that they're not religious anymore, right? That is the context. And one of the answers to that, according to some, is that we find God in popular culture now, and increasingly in video games. I want to test something, which is to see if the sound works. Did that work for everyone? I don't have any thumbnails because it's blocking my screen. Did that work, the sound? Great, okay, cool, so you're nodding. Yeah, so just for quick context, because like every argument, this argument is made by a person, which means it's fallible. Today I will also be a little bit reductionist because I'm trying to put 6 years of research into a couple of minutes. Today's argument is based on my PhD research, right, about video games and religion. It was supported and developed at various universities, including Deakin University in Melbourne, Université de Montréal, Tampere University, and KU Leuven. It's also under review as a book right now, which means that any feedback is very welcome, but please be gentle about it. And that if you happen to be an anonymous reviewer in the audience or someone watching the YouTube video, just ignore this, just try to pretend it's still anonymous. Also, I think importantly, before I start, I'm not religious myself. I think you can study religion well, whether you're religious or not. But just to be explicit about my approach, I approach my participants constructivistically, right? Which is a bad shorthand for saying that I believe that what they experience in their beliefs and all their things are true for them. And the way they speak about religion and religious positions, even if different participants might not agree on what is true, they're both kind of true to them. Social meaning is constructed. And I want to talk today about, about games such as, which kind of sold more than most movies. The themes, a theocratic alien race. Another example.
It's very difficult to understand what you're talking about, what you're saying, because it's pretty loud, the sound of video stuff.
Zelda, another example. The performative part of this might be weird, especially over Zoom, right? It doesn't work apparently. That's a shame. It works better in large rooms. The point of which is that it's weird that all these games, all these examples I've tried to show, right? Halo, Zelda, Assassin's Creed, and so on, they sound and they feel and they look like what we recognize historically as religion, right? And that is weird for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's weird that the biggest cultural industry in the world, right, relies on this sound and look and feel, the stories, the functions, and the substances of religion, when most of the people who buy them aren't religious anymore. It's weird, furthermore, that it's more likely for Western young people in the 21st century to encounter religion in video games such as those that I tried to shout over, again, which works better in a physical space than it does on Zoom, where I can't control volume. Apologies for that. But the point is clear, I hope, that we encounter religion more often in video games if we are Western young people in general in secularizing European settler descendant countries than in places of worship such as churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, and so on. And it's weird because we were kind of supposed to secularize according to a long tradition, right? There's a long tradition of social sciences where religion is presented as a part of history, where something that's been central to human civilizations for most of history is in some kind of steady decline. According to at least, the big four of social sciences, usually the kind of seminal daddies of sociology are seen as Auguste Comte, Karl Marx, Emile Durkheim, and Max Weber. And they write things like, Comte writes about l'état théologique ou fictif de nos connaissances, right? This like former state that we've left behind of a theological kind of thinking, of knowing, which he also calls fictive, which is then superseded by the superior modernist way of thinking about science, right? Through science and the scientific method. Karl Marx writes that alles Heilige wird entweiht under modernism. All that is holy is profaned is usually the translation. And Emile Durkheim, in his PhD thesis, writes that qu'il y a toujours moindre de croyances et de sentiments collectifs que nous pouvons reconnaître comme religieux. That there are less and less of those beliefs and those collective sentiments, right? And the things people do together that we recognize as religious. Definitions are a little bit difficult with Durkheim. That's another presentation, I think. Max Weber writes this, which I will translate just to make it easier. Which is that it's usually translated like this, right? That the increasing intellectualization and rationalization of modernism means that there are no longer any mysterious incalculable forces that come into play, but rather that one can, in principle, master all things by calculation, right? We can now understand things if only we put time into things. And this means, according to Weber, that the world is disenchanted, what he calls the Entzauberung der Welt. We no longer need recourse to magical means in order to master or employ the spirits, right? As did the savage for Weber, for whom like mysterious powers and magic still existed. Instead, we now have this rational worldview in which we no longer need religion. Weber is really sad about this. That's a long story, but it's because science doesn't really have answers to the questions that religion traditionally kind of answered, right? Why are we here? Why am I doing this? Things that we can't calculate and learn about. And this fits a trend where modernists are kind of killjoys. They kind of like to debunk all the nice things about the world. So Huizinga, a famous place scholar, is another one, right? Who writes in his last chapter that ever since the last quarter of the 19th century, games have been taken more and more seriously. That rules have become increasingly strict and elaborate. He writes this in 1938 when fascism is coming up, right, in Europe. And he kind of delegates play to the primitive past in the same way as Weber does with religion, writing that the savage knows nothing of the conceptual distinctions between being and playing. Savage is this naive kind of invented creature, right? They're primitive and their archaic ritual is sacred play. Right? Both Durkheim and Huizinga write about this Australian, indigenous Australian savage, not my words, that in Huizinga's example pretends to be a kangaroo, and as he's playing, he fully believes he's a kangaroo, right? And this kind of play and ritual and religion in Huizinga are the same thing. So we often in game studies see this kind of central metaphor of the magic circle, right? That people are trying to apply to video games, criticize. We see it in Salen Zimmerman, Mir Consalva, and all these texts you've read, where he writes Just to include my own language, I will again translate this. He writes that in my bad translation, has notoriously critical of this translation, of the official English translation, right? He writes, just that there is formally or structurally no difference between play and the sacred act. That is to say, the sacred act is in form the same as a game, so sacred places are also formally indistinguishable from play spaces. The arena, the card table, here it comes, the magic circle, straight after the temple, the theater, the movie screen, and a bunch of other metaphors, or examples rather. They are all in form and function hallowed ground. They're separated sacred terrains with their own rules, temporary worlds within the normal. So what Hazenga is saying is that in formal and structural ways, entering into the rules of a football match and what is important within that, and what is okay within that, that isn't okay outside of the 90 minutes of play in the field, he argues it's the same thing going on in the temple, right? Or when we do a Catholic ritual or a religious ritual or whatever. And some people apply this to video games, and I think we should be hesitant of this, because that's what a lot of authors do, right? This is not a straw man, but I have someone reductionistically grouped them by calling them, as a shorthand, the enthusiastic theologian. They're the theologians who find religion in games and are just really excited about that. So people like Rachel Wagner, whom I respect greatly, writes exactly what Hazenga is arguing, right? Both religion and games are at root, she writes, order-making activities that offer a mode of escape from contemporary life. And they demand, at least temporarily, that practitioners give themselves over to a predetermined set of rules that shape a worldview and offer a system of order and structure that is comforting because it's predictable and contained. She argues this. People like Leuven kind of does the same thing. Robert Geraci and a bunch of other people. One more example I really like of the enthusiastic theologian is actually a good friend of mine called Frank Bosman. And what he kind of does is, like, he sees religion represented in games, but he doesn't ask, so what then, right? So what Frank argues is that games are, well, that locus theologicus is when a cultural object, like a song, film, or dance performance, in them, like, God reveals himself to us as creator, savior, and whole maker, and in which this divine revelational act is reflected on in one way or another. Video games, he calls, as a theologian who looks for God in popular culture, some of those loci theologici, as finding places of faith and theology, right? Places for reflection and criticism about the God in our Western world that is hidden. So we haven't lost him, but he's in video games, right? So Frank would endorse the title of my presentation, Unironic, right? And I call these people enthusiastic theologians. So again, people who go looking for God, they see them in games and they go, oh, there it is. We thought we'd lost him, but he's still there. Just very quickly to indicate what I mean by religion when I talk about them, and this is important for the difference I want to argue for, is that even though it's true that in Europe and North America, at least in the 20th century, and especially since the 1960s, fewer of us are getting baptized. We see that rather than religion really declining, in many ways it's kind of changing. So the resolution from this video tells me it must be from the 60s or 70s, around which time Thomas Luckman wrote about privatized religion, right? That people seek to construct their own meaning outside of the church and what he calls bricolage. So we get New Age and like spirituality. We still see this in many ways in some traditions of practicing yoga or writing and talking and thinking about psychedelic drugs. We see this in many ways in which we treat meditation, horoscopes or astrology even, things like that, in which we kind of see that people are doing the same things that religion used to offer, or what we call religion in the Western world, but outside of churches, that in a way it's just changed, right? So just as a working definition, I wanted today define what religion is as a belief in supernatural substances, right, that are mediated through all these cultural objects, whether we pray to a Virgin Mary statue or whatever, and then we give meaning to in a social context, right? And this sociality has kind of moved, especially in the 20th century, then outside of big institutions, and partly, according to many, to media, right? Already mediated through cultural objects can also mean a film. So a lot of research into Pentecostal Christian communities or whatever argue that the way we see films like Passion of the Christ is just the same thing. It's just a different cultural object. But what changes when such objects are mediatized, or mediated through media, right? And then mass-produced for a global audience. Better yet, I want to ask, like, when those media demand an active role, in the case of video games, where we take a position in a virtual world, right, or are offered one, and then we act out an identity, what happens? So the empirical question of my research has kind of been to ask, how does that mass-produced mediatized context change what religion is, right? In other words, if it sounds and it looks and it feels and it functions like religion, as I tried to show at the start, we can still ask, so what? Right? So we may ask, where is your God now? And the enthusiastic theologian says, well, there he is, he's in video games. But my question is just very simply after that, to ask, so what? Right? So how does that change religion? And I try to answer that in a couple of ways, which I will go over very quickly today, by asking it in three parts. One of them by looking at the production of games, the content of games, secondly, and then the consumption, right? What do players do with that? So how do game makers use and change religion? How do games represent and change religion? And how do players consume and change religion? Yeah, and I did that a bunch of ways that I won't be able to fully represent now, but just, you know, to indicate that it's based on empirical research. I did interviews with Assassin's Creed developers as one title that I thought representative in many ways of AAA production, especially when it comes to religious production in games, or the production of religion in games, I'm sorry. By contrast, I tried to check with independent designers, mostly in Melbourne, from various religious backgrounds, just with the question of, do they put their religious background in them, right? I did a content analysis of various games. I looked at online player discussions and I interviewed a bunch of them, selected again theoretically for various backgrounds. So again, I'm going to be a little bit reductionist today. If you want to check whether I'm, you know, full of shit or not, this would be like the more elaborate article or text representing the arguments I'll be making today. But the aim is to make a self-contained argument and then to discuss it, right? So again, I'm really curious about your feedback, especially if you disagree with me. I don't know if Leonid is here or other specialists, but that would be nice.
He's here.
Okay, that's great. Let's start with the first example, right? Assassin's Creed. So I interviewed, what many people ended up calling the father of Assassin's Creed, so Patrice Désilets. He writes that he was a child of what Quebecois people call the Révolution tranquille. So it was this moment in the 60s and 70s where indeed people just left the church, kind of. And traditionally they were Catholic. So he says, at first I was like, yeah, sure, I'm Catholic because everybody is, but what really pissed me off was the church as an institution, right? He really had a problem with the church. Assassin's Creed is about that dogma. It's against it. Nothing is true. Everything is permitted. And when he read that, he was like, fuck yeah, that's the thing. I'm quoting. And that's basically how he lives now. And he wasn't alone. So he thought of the idea of Assassin's Creed. I know pretty much where exactly, but of course he made it in a team, right? And he says about that team that except for Corey May, the main writer, who's a Jewish Californian writer, he says, roughly put, we were all in that same background, from that same background, born into a Catholic family. Then suddenly that Catholic culture and faith just disappeared from Quebec and of those people, nobody would say they're religious anymore. So we were all in the same boat. And I'm quoting this to say that Assassin's Creed came from a very specific cultural background with a very specific attitude towards religion, right? Then something else happens. Assassin's Creed becomes really successful, and it becomes a really big thing, right? This is about, this is part of the timeline of Assassin's Creed now, presented here at GDC in 2018 by Jean Guédon. And what Jean Guédon came to do was he came to lead the entire franchise. And he had to come up with a formula to get all these studios in overlapping timelines to produce Assassin's Creed for a long while every year, right? And so he tried to standardize it. And I'm going to argue this is where a kind of commodification happened. I'll explain what that is, but it's important to me. And so the who of Ubisoft, right? If I ask like, who puts religion in these games for like a mostly secular audience, right? That who becomes this endless line of not just one person with a vision, but all these processes and bureaucracies. And they're sandwiched by kind of marketing research, right? Marketing does focus groups and so on and checks what do people want? What do people expect from a Viking game, for instance? And is then validated by editorial who signs off on it, which is basically a handful, literally 5 powerful people in Paris, right? And so the how and why religion is represented in Assassin's Creed kind of reflects that change in ownership. So what started out as this very Quebecois, anti-dogmatic, and very critical game, critical about religion, became this global grayscale. I'll explain what that means, what I mean by that, for kind of made for everyone, for a general audience, under these corporate incentives. So Jean Guédon said about this, he explained, my role on the brand team was to actually explain what AC was about for all these hundreds and thousands of people working on it. Right? For example, the positioning in terms of belief in spirituality, the fact that we don't want to take sides, we're trying to portray both sides as gray. So there's theoretically no good or bad, right? A game that was originally about Muslim assassins being very reductionist here, and Christian Templars becomes kind of for everyone. There are 2 different sides, and they fight for what they think is good for human society. This kind of stuff, which I think is telling to reduce it like that. And so the religiously and culturally specific becomes generic and universal, so you don't offend anyone and you can sell your game to everyone. And I think this is typical for, this is probably going to be similar, let's put it like that, in different franchises and different studios, right? And I was surprised to find that kind of for indies, it's the same thing. So we kind of expect indies, right, in the literature, and in many ways, this is true, to be more experimental and autobiographic, right? This was the promise of indie over the past 2 decades. But then when I asked them, people with their own religious convictions, they felt kind of alienated from that, because instead they were following this kind of standardized market convention, right? And it happens in 2 ways. One of them is that, as Li Shanglun, a Christian developer, said, well, when I want to put my authentic self into a game, whether it's Christian or, he's a more complex individual than just being a Christian, right? He says, how could I possibly do that? I feel much safer making these silly experiences, right? Throwing something in the market. He added later, and a lot of people echoed this, that also you want to sell your game, especially if you're an indie, you need to pay the rent, right? And so I was actually surprised to learn that a lot of them didn't put their authentic beliefs, right, into these games, partly because of the market. And then secondly, there's kind of conventions, right? So certain conventions instantly communicate mechanics, and this is very often how religion is used in games, right? Where we see priests, they're for healing, the church is like a safe space, paladins are holy warriors, and so on. And these are all from kind of standardized traditions, such as European Christianity. I talked to a lot of Australian developers who said, like, if we put any other kind of mythology or even, indigenous Australian things into it, that's technically okay, but the game becomes about that, right? So in many ways, these conventions of religion are there just as shorthand. Like you create 8 characters, you want one with a shield and like a sword, you just make it a paladin, put a big cross on them. If you want a healing character, you just make it like a Christian type priest. Rami Ismail said about this, he said, well, actually a paladin, for instance, is always a healer/warrior, right? Always dressed in white, always a hero of light. Believe me, if games originated from the Arabic world, if they hadn't started in the US, but like came from the Arabic world, paladins would be one of the most dangerous bad guys to encounter, depicted as bloody monsters, because they're literally crusaders, right? Not the lawful good kind of European bias we're used to. In the same way, shamans and druids are in very different ways representative of religion, right? Shaman is this kind of like destructive earth force. Okay. So in these 2 ways, just to end the production part, I want to first of all state that, well, argue that religious values here become commodified science when turned into a game, right? When produced into a game. So just a bit of text very quickly, but Karl Marx, just to explain what I mean by commodification, coins this term specifically as a process in which a use value is assigned to something without originally economic value, such as culture, or in this case, religion, in order to make it exchangeable. Arjun Appadurai calls a commodity anything intended for exchange, as Marx does, with, importantly, maximum feasible reduction of social, cultural, political, or personal transaction costs, right? Meaning is kind of erased. In this case, you know, the product is, when it's commodified, or these signs are commodified, they're alienated from developers' own convictions and the systems of ultimate meaning that religion usually offers for them in their private lives. It's just, it needs to be reduced to something sold specifically to everyone. Cultural commodification then, to kind of acknowledge Rami's point again, according to bell hooks, is a form of eating the other by bringing the cultural other, such as in this case the shaman or the Muslim, into kind of the hegemonic worldview, where, yeah, games are, at least in the representation of religion, conventionally Eurocentric. That is what's palatable. And so indie specifically, also through the precarity of their work, counter to what has been written about them, right, are at least in this case driven to reduce religious values into standardized, westernized, commodified signs, just as AAA does, because they need to pay the rent, right? So that's a first process that I wanted to argue for. And then secondly, what happens if we look at the games itself, right? How is religion represented once they're produced? And how does that change religion? I looked at some data on how players talked about games and which games they mentioned specifically, which I will get back to. But I selected a bunch of those to write what I will very quickly reduce. But yeah, basically 4 content analyses, right? And just to reduce these very badly, and I'm open to discussion about these later, and I'm happy to refer to the articles that, so BioShock presents religion as power, right? We see this in a lot of games where religion becomes a tool kind of for a theocracy or another kind of power, where it turns out to be a manipulative tool after all. Assassin's Creed is very close to this as well. Final Fantasy presents religion as cultural heritage, but kind of flattens different sacred traditions, right? So in Final Fantasy, you can have Shiva and Leviathan from the Bible, and Ifrit, which is like a pre-Islamic Arabic folklore creature. You can have all these kind of like, aside from each other, they're all true. It's like eclectically together. They're true and they become interchangeable with each other. Assassin's Creed presents religion as this kind of conspiracy theory, right? A tool for the Templars specifically throughout history to kind of control historical societies. And games like Fallout and Horizon Zero Dawn and other kind of like sci-fi, especially apocalyptic games, present religion as not just a thing in history, but also as ways of making sense of the unknown, right? So incomprehensible technology, atomic power for Fallout, AI for Horizon Zero Dawn becomes kind of seen as divine because we don't understand this. These are kind of four separate analyses, but I want to kind of grab these together and say that besides, already the transformation that I first argued for from substance to commodity, I hope I'm not going too quickly, being too dense. The sacredness of gods, right, that are traditionally for thousands of years prayed to and believed in, become not just commodities, but they also become simulacra. So something like Leviathan from the Bible and Shiva from Hinduist traditions, or generally like Desi religious traditions, are kind of put together and become entirely divorced, as I said, from their cultural specificity. And as a consequence, that sign, that representation of those gods, apart from their tradition, becomes what Plato calls a simulacrum, right? Which is a distorted representation, traditionally, specifically of a deity, without an inner resemblance, without a true model. It lacks the crucial dependence upon the original, right? They become simulacra because they're divorced from their original. This is something that where Baudrillard also writes about famously, right? That in this case, sacred gods and rituals and so on are represented kind of like in their own context of Final Fantasy or another game. And they're divorced from this sacred tradition of worshiping them, right? So they become simulacra. That's the second thing I wanted to say. So first of all, just to slow down a bit, religious substance becomes commodified. And then secondly, the way it's represented in games becomes a simulacrum. I'll tie this all in at the end, I promise. But first I want to quickly look at like, okay, we've seen how it's produced. I should have made this a pop-up. We've seen how it's produced. I argued for a certain way in which it's represented, but then games can do whatever they want, right? And what games do by offering all these different worldviews, for instance, is that they offer the possibility to temporarily think like someone else or step into someone else's shoes. These are quotes by people I interviewed. Usually there's a bunch of slides with quotes from people, but felt like I wouldn't have time for that today. And people do that from all kinds of different backgrounds themselves, right? So agnostic players, Christian players, Hindu players, and others I've interviewed are kind of put into these positions, whether it's being a traditionally Islamic assassin in 12th century Jerusalem in the first Assassin's Creed, or again in Final Fantasy in these worlds where like all these gods exist, or even made up religions like Skyrim and so on, where they are real. And so this form of kind of role playing the religious other, like playing as someone who believes or lives in the world at least where a certain belief is true, right? Temporarily appears to bracket players' own worldview, right? What sometimes is called a suspension of disbelief, but in this case, a suspension of belief, right? Where people like Gunther, a pseudonym for a German agnostic person, said, "The more I feel a blurring of the avatar in myself, the more believable the game world becomes. Because during these moments, my real self doesn't remind me of things I wouldn't normally accept or believe." So people like Gunther, and I heard this a lot, and I read it in discussions, in a game at least, I'm not saying they use a game for that purpose, but when they're playing a game, they bracket what they believe or don't believe in. They can be agnostic because, it doesn't make sense. In that Weberian world of like, we can explain everything, how can we believe in a God? Many agnostics, like myself, believe when there's no equal proof for that. But in a game, that doesn't matter because a game is believable. That world is believable. And so you play as someone who believes, you play a religious other. And the other way around, the same kind of thing happens. Or between religions as well. So for atheist and agnostic players, role-playing religious characters or religious worlds, such as Assassin's Creed or Skyrim, offered them this temporary re-enchantment and beliefs that they had lost, if we use a Weberian kind of mourning, right, in their rational secular lives. For believers, this kind of ultimate meaning of things that traditionally religions provide, right, are kind of disturbed by that. So people could temporarily play as people who don't believe, or people who believe something different, such as when you're a Christian or a Hindu, but you play as someone who believes in the gods of Skyrim. This becomes kind of problematized, which is to say that by playing the other, some players came to this kind of relativization of the absolute truths that they were brought up with, right, as partly culturally determined and even replaceable. Right? If I can play and feel that way for a while, how come this belief that I have that I have outside of the game? I'm getting emotional. Sorry. Oh God. I'm getting a cold. Oh, this is great. Okay, hold on. Okay, so yeah, it became this kind of tool for relativization. Wow. Okay. It became what I ended up calling a pop theology, where people ended up also going online and publicly. Wow, that's not great. Okay, so people also went online and did that. And there's where I think something final and interesting happens that I'll tie back into the end, which is that contrary to sociological ideas, like I said at the start, of privatization, right? Where after the 60s, religion becomes a private thing that people do through New Age instead of through institutions. They begin talking about religion more publicly online through these institutions.
I think it's okay if you go to you can take some glass of water and and drink.
No, it's not helping. It's not helping. It's a bug. I mean, it's going to be outrageous to say this to a Russian audience, but it's getting really cold in Belgium. Right. So, but the point is that instead of this privatization of people seeing religion and thinking about religion outside of church institutions, they actually talk about this vehemently online. And they do so based on other kinds of institutions like game companies. So we get discussions like this, right? This is the final empirical part, where people, without having to read all of this, right? People have their different opinions about a game, and they will make readings of different games that are completely divorced from each other and divorced from authorial intention, right? So Assassin's Creed might be either anti-religion, or it might be kind of like deliberately grayscaled, but people from specific backgrounds, for instance, Christian players, will interpret this as a Christian game, whereas atheists will not. And I think that's a final interesting thing that happens. People will have super elaborate discussions, again, without having to read them, about what it means that Zelda, the Zelda games, use different kinds of religious signs, right? So they do so in different ways. I don't want to go into all of them, but that is the main thing I argue in that paper, which is that some people reject worldviews because they don't agree with the game in favor of their own, right? Where they debunk everything as like unimportant, or they will debate, like in the last screenshot, like all these mutually exclusive interpretations. Again, BioShock has been read as a super Christian game, or as one that's critical of religion, right? Just as every other game is kind of interpreted through the lens of the person playing it. And finally, some people ended up connecting to new worldviews, even sometimes leading to conversions and changes outside of the game. But more importantly, I want to say that in these discussions, they do something that we thought had, kind of been forgotten, which is they have these discussions about religion publicly, and they discuss the epistemological status of God and faith and sacred texts, and what it means for a sacred text to have a special status versus, something as trivial as a game. And I called this a pop theology, right, where there's a popular kind of logos of the Deus going on, where people are doing theology, but in this pop setting. yeah, so these discussions on theology prompted by pop culture, right? Which are collective, comparative, amateuristic. More importantly, they're in the public sphere. So these are three kind of loose arguments, right? Let's repeat them very quickly. Let's ignore all of this, and then I'll tie them together and hopefully we can discuss them. Where, yeah, like I argued first, the game industry changes religious substance into commodities, right? This complete reduction of cultural specificity. Games then end up with these substances being furthermore stripped of their sacrality, stripped of their sacredness. They become what Baudrillard and Plato and Umberto Eco and others call a simulacrum. And then finally, standardized mass consumption ironically returns this completely flattened, stripped religion, nonetheless to the public sphere, right? And so how does that change religion, you could ask? So how does religion's appearance in video games as a commodified, a standardized set of simulacra change the way that we should think of religion in video games? Well, I argue that it changes the way we need to theorize religion in some very important ways, right? Alongside the way that religion still exists, but still. So that is religion as not just a matter of belief or disbelief always, right? Where belief is this epistemological stance towards something, where we believe something, we hold something to be true just because of conviction. To also alongside that, not just a matter of belief or disbelief, but as an epistemology of play, which means that, when I earlier defined religion as beliefs in supernatural substances, the epistemological attitude of belief is different than one of play, right? Where you hold something to be true temporarily, like if you play a game of football. And the main kind of difference I think that games so clearly introduce is, while it is such a different way of doing things, we can only kind of make sense of that if we allow religions to be temporarily engaged with, just as Huizinga kind of argues, where in that case, billions of gamers, like again, the biggest cultural industry, they don't play with, but they play at religion, or at being religious, just as we might be playing doctor, right? Where you play at being mommy and daddy, or playing house. So people are experimenting with and trying on identities and worldviews kind of in earnest, but without belief. And so if there's one big theoretical contribution, it's that in the eyes of players, what may kind of sound and look and feel and even somewhat function as religion, it's not something you have to believe in to make sense of it. You don't have to employ it as a worldview to explain the entire world from birth to death and afterwards, which is traditionally what religion does, right? But instead, we can do this in earnest, but confined to a screen, to a keyboard or a controller, and it ends with kind of the power button. And I want to say that's where God went, right? So for many of us, yes, religion is still there, but it's reduced to commodities. It's removed from their sacred tradition. It becomes publicly part of a cultural industry. And without saying this is a bad change at all, I'm just describing this, or describing what I found. Video games changed religions, I want to say, radically into something that can now also be just tried on, compared and discarded at a whim. And I say that's something I want to talk about today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lars. I think it was really great presentation. I just looking for this reaction. Yeah, I used it. Way to make uploads in Zoom conference. Yeah. So now we can begin with the Q&A section. Does anybody have some questions right now? Yeah, Leonid, you are here. Okay, so first, Leonid.
Hello, thank you very much. And I guess, at first I didn't have any questions because your presentation was just so comprehensive. So I kind of could not grab anything. I hear an echo. I think it's coming from you, Lars. Okay. Thank you very much. But I guess my question right now is, did you conduct any analysis of this pop theology? I mean, are there any trend in pop theology? What are the most common topics players discuss? Something maybe that is present in multiple video games, in discussion about multiple video games, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Leonid. I assume you have a great answer to this as well. So I propose I first kind of like give my my view, and then I'm really curious about what.
I actually do not, because I do not do any sociological studies, so I'm completely in the dark here. You can tell whatever you want, and I will believe you like 100%.
Yeah. So what I found, and so first of all, there's a difference, right, between when I look at when I try to analyze the content of games as someone who just spent a couple years reading, because I luckily got paid for it, with a background in literary theory and stuff like that. Those readings are very different from what players do. And there's an ambulance. And secondly, readings of players are very different from each other. And then thirdly, readings of players can be radically different from what developers intended to do, right? But what I saw most often, the biggest group by far in public discussions about games is people just took the content and ran with it. So Christians would very often just, end up analyzing Assassin's Creed as a Christian game, when atheists analyzed Assassin's Creed as an atheist game. And this kind of ran through all the examples, whether it's Devil May Cry, Shin Megami Tensei, Final Fantasy, the biggest group of players against everything that video game makers are trying to do, and that we as academics try to do in very informed ways. Players don't care about that. They make it their own thing. And I think that's a very important insight. I think BioShock is the best example of this, where almost unilaterally in most analyses by critics, by reviewers, and by academics, it's kind of like this super critical game of the way that religion can be abused in a theocracy. But players didn't care about that. They just saw their own views confirmed in it. So to answer your question very briefly, what I saw most is just people finding their own beliefs back in whatever game you threw at them.
So in a way, it is more about appropriation than actual meaning making. Players need to tell themselves that it's okay to play and enjoy this game. Or am I oversimplifying?
Well, I think you're making it way too complex. I think there's no difference in effect here between appropriating or making meaning, or what Stuart Hall would call encoding, probably, which is that people from their position in society, and in this case, intersectionally, that would be their religious position, they just end up understanding what they consume. They end up decoding what they consume as, according to their own position. So in that sense, all meaning making turns out to be, or at least for the biggest group, turns out to be appropriation. They just make it their own.
Okay, if anyone else have questions, I think I will give the floor, but I still have questions, like a few, so
okay, so
keep me in mind.
Yeah. So yeah, I just wanted to say you that it's better to use this virtual hand. So Mark Pashenko just used it. Please, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. And the question I have in mind is, maybe have you in your research encountered cases or perhaps even anecdotes of these commodified modes of religion being used as genuine mediums, perhaps for missionary or religious activity, or trying to involve people in this genuine, non-commodified religious experience? And maybe from my experience, this kind of already bland example of creating virtual churches in Minecraft, and there's this case, and I will give a link here, where enthusiasts from some kind of maybe a church congregation creates a virtual space because of the lockdown situation for participants of the church to gather in. But I would be more interested personally in examples where more non-trivial examples where it's not just a virtual space that is constructed in a sandbox game, but the specific and mechanics that are customary to some game worlds are used in this manner, and not only in missionary activity perhaps, but maybe even as a kind of reflective theological activity and exploration that takes into account the commodified aspect of the religion's representation in game as you have described.
Thank you. I think those are, first of all, great examples, right, where people take games in which you can create your own content, such as Minecraft or Second Life, and kind of create their own sacred spaces within that game. So my analysis doesn't exclude that, right? There are even kind of direct commodifications where people end up almost accidentally or unintentionally worshipping something. So there's the famous kind of story that became viral, right, of the elderly Chinese woman, I don't know where in China this was, that was praying to a League of Legends character, right, a statue called Garen that she mistook for a representation of a god. But I think these are kind of separate from, first of all, the process. So what I describe as commodification is where a game is produced in a certain way that it's first stripped of that cultural specificity, right? If you are not aware of a deity before you meet the game doesn't give you kind of that context necessarily to worship it. Of course, on the other hand, that's separate from the way players, again, like decode or understand the games or even act within those games, right? So if you do have that pre-existing belief before the game, nothing will stop those players from taking that content, even unintentionally, as religious, right? I'm not sure that's a satisfying answer because it sounds really disappointing to myself.
I think it's I think it's satisfying in a sense that it contextualizes the problem in the context of your research. So thank you for the answer. I was maybe trying to, just continuing on what you have said, trying to outline the possibility of decommodification and this kind of refilling of the substance of the science of religion science that was commodified in the process of production by the players, by their own reflective agency and theological agency.
Yeah, I think yeah, sorry. Lars, you wanted to say something.
Well, that's exactly it, right? It's I like that metaphor of the refilling, right? If you empty out a certain commodity, but you bring to it a meaning you already had before encountering the game as an object, or however you want to frame that, nothing will stop those players, of course, from refilling it with that meaning. What I'm trying to theorize, in especially the first part, is that before being able to put it into a game meant for a mass market, it's first emptied out of that meaning, hollowed out of that meaning. I think those are separate processes.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for the question, Mark.
So good. Now we have also 3 questions. Ollie, please.
Hello, thank you, Lars, for a very interesting presentation. I would like to ask you a question about taking this toward the experience of the religious person or the player. If there are any sort of parallels or overlaps you see between the experience of play and the experience of religious belief. You mentioned before what Huizinga was, I can't pronounce the name in a native way like you did, but what he talked about, the parallels between religious ritual and play. I was also reminded by Thomas S. Hendricks, who has the sort of fourfold model, within which he has the communitas, community, being in a community and then play. And he sees similarities between these two in terms of sort of the phenomenology of the experience and its implications toward the wider world. And then sort of you were hopeful, or you were sowing some seeds of hope in the beginning. Whether we can harvest these is the question. Whether there would be enough of these parallels to justify possibly considering the importance of play in culture these days, whether it can rescue us from this Weberian calculating mindset that you mentioned. Can play, as we know it from computer games, is it too hopeful to say that it could perhaps save us from this calculation, take us back to that age of innocence that Huizinga was kind of talking about? That's my question. Thanks.
Thanks, Ollie. Happy Independence Day, although that might be sensitive in some contexts. Yeah, so there's two questions, right? If I understood them correctly, one is that like how much of this parallel between the sacred act and playtime with Huizinga and others kind of stays intact. And then secondly, can play then re-enchant this, desolate world lost of meaning? And I think they're related questions for very good reasons. And so first of all, yes, I mean, there is still as much of the enchantment of a sacred act as there is in play. I think that analysis by Huizinga stands. Thomas Hendricks talks about communities of play in the same way that Robert Garaci, a theologian, and Bainbridge, a sociologist of religion, go into World of Warcraft and they play this thing and they decide, hey, these are just like the religious functions that Durkheim explains, right? So in Durkheim's idea of religion, religions are just recognizable by something that functions like religion. Like they bring communities together, they give them a common moral set of values, and all these kinds of things that actually World of Warcraft does. World of Warcraft and many games and many forms of play function in the same way that religions do. This is a very slippery category, I think, because that also means that being a fan of a football club functions the same way as being a Catholic, right? You go to like a place that you hold special, you share a certain collective effervescence, right? You sing the same song and you walk away from that match thinking, oh, that was special. The rest of the day is just the normal, mundane, everyday life, but that is profane. That means a lot to me. And also extends into belief, right? If you're a fan of Arsenal or whatever, I don't know a lot about football, then that stands for something greater than just the players on the field and the coaches, whatever. You can take all those parts out, and still that idea of Arsenal is quite unironically holy, right? That's a slippery category, first of all, because I think that usually we don't. Renata Antelia says in Greek, fans call football stadiums temples. I think that's very indicative, right? But there's still something in which we recognize in the end as Arsenal not being the same as Catholicism. And I think that's where belief in supernatural substances comes in. But yeah, it becomes an almost arbitrary thing, right? It's like, is religion really different from football? And this is, if I could solve this problem, I'd solve a lot of problems in the sociology of religion. But I think intuitively, at least, we could say that it might not function that way. But yeah, it doesn't stop Robert Garaci and people like Thomas Hendricks from arguing quite similarly that communities of play have these shared values and experiences that stand outside of normal life. And that leads to, I think, the final part, which is whether play can lead to an escape from this disenchanted Weberian world. And I think unironically it does, but the main problem is it does so temporarily, right? This is more of maybe like an individual phenomenological argument always, although I'm aware I'm in your territory then. But when I play games like that, it does feel different. And I do not feel the stress and importance of my own to-do lists. I just feel the to-do lists and the worldviews of the world that I'm playing in, right? Whether it's what's the airplane game you talked about in 2014, or the truck manager game you wrote about in 2019, 18, I think it functions in that way, in that it temporarily takes me outside of the disenchanted, disenchanted life I lead, asking if there's meaning for things and how can they be explained. When that question doesn't come into games, I enter into that temporary world, and it all makes sense because it's a game in a contained world. And I think that is in many ways, even without religious content explicitly, a re-enchanting experience, if that makes sense.
It does very much, thank you. To pick up on what Renata also pointed out, I have a similar sort of little anecdote. Monks were forbidden to be bored, wasn't it? Because that would have meant that God cannot satisfy them. But they are forbidden from being bored. Players also are not supposed to be bored. It's a sign that the game designer has not made a good job if the player is bored.
I want to argue there's a difference between what I understand from the first tradition versus play, where monks had to basically always pray or recite or use the rosary, right? Which is like this device, which I think is very far away from most definitions or most understandings of play, because you're just reproducing what has been written. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know enough about it.
Yeah, that's
Thank
yeah. Thank you, Oli, for your question. Yeah, I also thought about this, but I think I will share my ideas about this question also in the end, because I'm a moderator here right now. So, but I think so. I think it's more important to give an opportunity for Renata to ask her question, and then I'm sorry there are two more questions, but I think we need to skip them, but take them in mind, or maybe just write them down. Pavel and Roman, we will come to them in the general discussion after two other talks. Yeah. So sorry, Renata, please.
Thank you, Lars, for that very interesting presentation. I have two questions actually, but since we're running out of time, feel free to answer whichever you want. The one is about Nier Automata, the game, because there I think it does a nice play with religion, because it is humanity that takes on the form of the deity and this unattainable other, and it goes also to themes of posthumanism, of course. I would like your opinion on that. And the other thing is religious sacrifice and play or in games, if you have an opinion on that. Thank you very much.
That's a very densely worded question. I'll try to start with the first one, and then I'm not sure if I understood the second one, but that might be because I was processing the first one. I think Nier Automata is a great example because it features so many robots that are trying to cope with the question that Weber says we have left now that we're in this disenchanted world, including some existential robots, right? So yeah, they apparently try to make sense of what is left of human culture by picking up those same questions. And I don't know if I can say much more about this than that Nier fits in this nice tradition where we try to imagine this completely post-cultural world, right? Without spoiling too much, at least humanity is not we don't see humans in the game. It's robots that have inherited this. And apparently they've become so smart that even when all religion is kind of like reduced to history, there's still these entities coping with these existential questions that science or rationality can't solve. You see the same thing, I think, in many ways in Horizon Zero Dawn. So I think that's a great example of how even when we imagine fictional worlds without humans, we still have these deeply human questions. As for religious sacrifice, I wouldn't. Do you have any good examples?
Well, my take was mostly that, for example, Battle Royale games are actually a reenactment of sacrificial rites. I have a paper coming out regarding this. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, if you consider that there is some there are some affinities there. like, for example, we also have the same concept in Hunger Games, like in other media as well, like Squid Game is a very pop example nowadays. So I just had this connection in mind.
Yeah, that's one ritual I'd like to know more about. But I just want to say this, that I think following again Huizinga and all these arguments, whatever I end up concluding about the nature of religion or how we should reframe religion as a epistemological attitude, games just formally in their structures are so well fit to mimic rituals, because rituals are nothing else than a rule-structured kind of meaning-making device that only is self-contained, only makes sense in itself. So yeah, I'm curious about your paper. I'm looking forward to it.
So yeah, thank you all for your questions. Thank you again, Lars. I think now we need to go further to the contributions prepared by two other participants of the meeting today. So the first one will be given by Yulia Varyukhina, and as I remembered, it will be called "The World is a Cult: Horror of Religion in Keiichiro Toyama Games." I am not sure that I'm pronouncing the name of this game designer correctly. Yeah, so please, Yulia, are you? Yeah, you're here.
Yeah, I'm here. Hello, I will share my screen. Okay. So I will introduce myself briefly because I didn't do it on our first meeting. My name is Varyukhina Yulia, postgraduate, HSE, Art and Design School, and my research is about Japanese horror, manga, movies, and of course games. So today I will tell you a little bit about games made by Kiichiro Toyama. So who is Kiichiro Toyama? Well, I guess he is just like horror Kojima. List of the games he made are not so big, but these games are very important not only for the Japanese horror games industry, but for all horror games industry in general. Toyama is the creator of the first Silent Hill and Silent Hill ID exactly, and the Forbidden Siren series, which had a very big impact on all aspects of horror games as a genre. And I guess Toyama found his first inspiration in Resident Evil, but then he created his own system of intimidation and game scenarios, full of some mystic rituals, riddles, uncanny ghosts, and so on. And of course, Toyama is not the only one who uses religious motives in his games. Theme of mystic rituals are very common for Japanese culture itself. We can see it in other games such as Fatal Frame or Corpse Party, or in manga, movies, anime, and so on. But overwhelmingly in horror games, religion is used as some sort of force that can resist evil. Sometimes it can be exorcism-like gameplay features like in Phasmophobia, for example, or religious symbols can look sort of damaged to show the player the full darkness of the world in which he found himself. I mean that all this stuff with scary nuns, inverted crucifixes, and etc. And it works. It works well because this is how horror genre uses religion in games and movies. Because we have a group of visual images and metaverse which context is already known, so it will work regardless of the circumstances. But Toyama uses religion in a brand new way. He has no need in obvious images. As a main horror instrument, he chooses something you can't see at a first sight, a faith. I call this Tsuyama's method damage phase method, because this is how his horror system works. Exuberant, fanatic phase changes not only lives of innocent people, but a world around them. It made it cruel and irreversible. We can see it both in Silent Hill and in Siren. It may sound strange, but there is no difference between damaged Catholic-based religion in Silent Hill and half hidden, half Shinto-based religion in Siren. The main symbols Tsuyama uses are different, okay, but it is needed only for the right atmosphere. The center person of God, both in Silent Hill and Siren, are kind of impersonal, I guess. We have images of them, we have their story, but the Holy Mother in Silent Hill and Daratsushi in Siren have no real power. On the other hand, people who formed a cult around them have. Not gods are providing evil, the people do. And the power of a cult in Tsuyama games is hypertrophied and grotesque, and I guess that's normal because we can see big things clearly. For the first sight, it can look like a cult only has an impact on a limited area, Silent Hill or Hanuda village, but in the end we can see that all involved people, protagonists, and other characters have taken part of this cult with them. Even if they found their escape, the world around them wouldn't be safe for them anymore. When Harry Mason escaped Silent Hill, when Harry Mason escaped Silent Hill, he never found peace for him and his daughter. And when Harumi Yamura rescued from Hanuda, her wounds never fully healed. The damage done by actions of the cult cannot be explained because characters face enormous events. Events created by the ancient powers as deep as an idea of the world itself. And when they look under the cover of mystery that they obviously can't fully comprehend, they just lose themselves. But as long as all this is provided by people cursed by the damaged phase, the fear always will always stay real. People are much more cruel than gods, and that's why Tsuyama's structure works so well, because this kind of horror has no real end. And Tsuyama builds his vision from tons of different details. Of course, the monsters take the central part of the system. The monsters of Silent Hill were designed from the fears and regrets of one of the main characters, Alessia Gillespie. For example, the Great Children. Great children vaguely resemble children with knives. In school, Alessa was bullied by her classmates, and moreover, they carved curses on her desk. And that's why great children have knives. Great children are the first monsters that Harry met, just like cruel classmates. The first chapter of Lisa's long history of suffering. Her life was destroyed by the cult, and in the game we have two versions of Silent Hill, the normal one and the one which we can see when the siren starts to sound. The second version is the image of damaged Alessa's soul, merciless, cruel, frozen in the anticipation of her revenge. And in Siren, main monsters are not so psychologically symbolized, but quite interesting too. So-called Shibito are the product of the Dadatsushi's cult itself. Shibita have many forms. The simplest of them look like blue-colored people with blood tears on their faces. Others can look like dogs, so-called Inoshibito, or spiders, Kumoshibito, and so on. To change their form and evolve, Shibita need to take part in two rituals, Umi Okuri and Umi Gairi. They bathe in the red water of Mana River to gain a new form, and then take a part in the main job, building a nest for Datatsushi's reborn. Player can't kill Shibita, they're kind of immortal, but can use one interesting gameplay feature, looking through Shibita eyes to understand how to avoid the attack. Model of Shibita behavior resembles a beehive. The main goal of each is to revive Datatsushi. Here we can see how the view of Toyama evolves and become more fatalistic. In the Silent Hill, cult was not only created but represented by people. The existence of Shibita itself is a result of people's actions, so maybe we can say that the world of Silent Hills look a little more positive than Hanuda because Silent Hill is on the doorstep of an apocalypse, but Hanuda already is a post-apocalyptic world. And of course, people are in charge of it. And a little bit about cults itself. The cult of Silent Hill is called the Order, and in spite of many Catholic symbols, can be read as a hidden cult. The leader of the Order in the first Silent Hill, Dala Gillespie, is so obsessed with the idea of reviving her god that she burned her own daughter Alessa, and Alessa was alive for 7 years, suffering from burns all over her body to give life to Dala's god. In the Siren, the Retsushi cult looks more like a form of redemption. Many years ago, Hanuda residents ate the god, who descended to them, and from that moment they tried to wash away their sin. And of course, the only way for this is reviving their god by human sacrifices and foundation of a cult. This blind, damaged, fanatic faith in God, merciful God or punishing God, and fear of Him and rules of the cult produce even more fear and damage. Tsuyama created walls that are looped in a circle of violence and terror, and his games have open endings, alerting that nothing are over, and both of these worlds are not occupied by cults. They are cults itself. And I guess I need to stop here. I gave a very brief summarized analysis of the religious work for Tsuyama, but I hope it was interesting, so thank you.
Thank you, Yulia. Yeah, thank you again. Right, mouse. Made the right thing. So please, does anybody have some questions to Yulia? There are 2 minutes that we can use for it now. So no. Well, actually, then I will ask a question. Maybe I think you haven't said some important points of your talk because you had run out of time, as you have run out of time, as I understood. I think so. That's why I want to ask you if there were some points left by you. Did you want to say some other things before you have a couple of minutes?
Well, no, right now I have nothing to say more because, well, I know my timing and I try to make my speech in 10 minutes, but I work on this theme and of course it's much deeper than I show right now. But in situation like this, I have no time to tell you all about some symbols and connections and meanings, and so it's my idea was made a very very brief speech, because otherwise it will be last very, very long.
Yeah, good. Thank you. So I think if somebody understands afterwards that he or she has some questions to you, you will also have an opportunity to ask a question during the general discussion after another contribution made by the next participant. And the next participant, namely, is Leonid Moises. So I don't see the exact topic, the exact title of the presentation that we proposed on Facebook in our group, but I think that he didn't need one. So please, Leonid, if you yeah, oh, he just told me that he just typed sent message that he needs 5 minutes. Anyway, well then, I think it's time. There were 2 other questions to Lars. I think it's possible to ask them right now. The first one was, yeah, Lars. Okay, so you have something to say.
I didn't have a question for myself.
Okay.
I wanted to quickly pick up on some things that Julia showed.
Yeah.
Where, yeah, I guess my question is, how should we make sense of like the use of all this Catholic, well, Christian, but very specifically Catholic representation in Japanese games like that? How does the game frame those? How do they treat those? And how would you make sense of that occurrence of this like mystical, occult Western religion in this, you know, very Japanese game, if you want to.
Oh, okay, I'm still here. Yes, yes, it's kind of I can say messy, because it's just an atmospheric image, you know, because it's they take when some Japanese game designers use Catholic and Christian symbols and religions as the base for their own, they just take maybe I can say a control system of rules, and maybe some visual images, and you can see it clearly when you see the game with Catholic religion in base, and something with Shinto or Buddhist thematic, like if we will take Silent Hill Fatal Frame, or Siren is more complicated in this way, because this is not correct too. So it's like a very rough image, I guess. It's not very deep in the meaning of Catholic Christian religion itself. It's very rough. It's just an image. They can't put the context in it, because I think they can't fully understand it, even when Japanese people are Christians, not all, but very huge percent. They have a very how to say it, a Japanese culture, not very communicative with other cultures. So that's why they can't fully comprehend it and put it in real way. They just can make a very, very rough image, but it can be interesting to investigate and search.
So I think that relation, Yulia, could compare the way how religion in Silent Hill is produced with the way how Epicurus imagined how the gods are created by the Eidolon that are overcombined and recombined in those how to say it, in those spheres between the worlds, and then finally, it also has some relation some relation to the problem of simulacra, as Deleuze also pointed out in some of his papers about it. I think it was called Lucretius and Simulacra, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not. I'm sorry. I'm very bad about pronouncing correctly the Greek and Latin last names of ancient philosophers in English. I'm bad about, but I hope you understood whom I meant right now. Anyway, thank you, Lars, again, and thank you, Yulia, for your short discussion. And now, Leonid, are you back?
Yep.
Yeah.
I am.
So please, you have 15 minutes for the talk and Q&A section, both.
Okay. Can you see the presentation?
No. Yeah, nice start.
I worked about half the time I used to make this presentation on coming up with funny enough title. Anyway, sorry. I would like to briefly, as briefly as possible, talk about the approach to depicting religion or presenting religion in video games. Sorry. Video game Pathfinder versus Righteous, using Nier smart concept of religious dimensions. This game is mostly interesting in this context, not in itself, but as an example of an established approach to the representation of religion in video games that is so widespread that we can talk about its naturalization in Bart's sense. I mean, a lot of people cannot even begin to coming up with any different ideas as to how to represent religion in video games. But it should be noted firstly that this approach itself reflects a very specific view of religion inspired by Christianity and even more narrowly by American Protestantism. And secondly, there are projects which follow different logics. Those alternatives are important as evidence that we are dealing with an ideological phenomenon that reflects the specific biases of the developers and supposed players as developers imagine them, and not the objective limitation inherent in the video game medium itself, which could be theoretically the case. Anyway, I will talk about Pathfinder versus Righteous. It's a fairly recent video game in the world of Pathfinder, which itself is a clone of tabletop RPG Dungeons and Dragons, dealing with conflict between people and demons. I will talk about it in a minute more. But for now, let's talk about my theoretical base and talk about theories by Ninian Smart. A Scottish scholar of religion, he proposed the concept of religious dimension as an alternative to the widespread essentialist approach in religious studies, which implicitly or explicitly put at the center of this discipline the question of the origin of religion and the search for it, how can I put it, hardcore something which presupposed any religion, whether it is collective unconsciousness, some sort of trauma, etc., societal relations, etc., etc. Smart's methodology, in turn, focused on the classification of differences between religion and, more broadly, on the organization of empirical materials, material without putting forward the question of what religion is and what it is, I don't know, at its heart. For this purpose, Smart proposed to divide our data on any religion, specific tradition, or religious community between 7 different dimensions. You can see them and the quick characterization and example from Christianity here. I believe the difference are pretty straightforward, but just to reiterate, the doctrinal dimension includes religious philosophy, metaphysics, and ontology. Mythological dimensions imply religiously significant narrative. The ethical dimension encompasses the idea of right and wrong inherent in the particular religion. The ritual dimension is constituted by concrete actions to which religion attaches great importance. The social dimension includes both the issues of organizing the community of believers itself and related problems of interaction between the religion and wider society. The emotional dimension implies various emotional states that religion attaches great importance to, like meditation or religious fervor. And finally, the material dimension consists of objects, whether man-made or natural, endowed with a special meaning in a particular religion or religious community. Smart assumes that any religion, at least superficially, includes each of those dimensions, includes elements belonging to each of those dimensions, but differs significantly in their hierarchy. In my talk, I would like to describe which of those dimensions receives the most attention in simulating or representing the religion in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. Representing, it's not simulating. The central religious dimension in this game is social. The plot of the game, as I said before, is built around the conflict between demons who broke into fantasy world of Galarian through the portal called Worldwound, and the Crusaders who gathered to stop them. Even such brief description of the plot demonstrates the importance of religion as a social and political designation. The very words cultists and crusaders, they are borrowed from the game, they're not something I brought here, are extremely often present in the game and have a clearly religious origin. And are interpreted in the game as such. Cultists are actual cultists. They venerate the demon lords like Lord of Locust Discari, Devil-inspired Baphomet, and Nocticula, Queen of Sakabi, while Crusaders act accordingly to the teaching of the goddess of knighthood, Iomedae. Moreover, the very status of the protagonist, Lord Commander of the Fifth Crusade, is both religious and political, and throughout the game we are repeatedly faced with the need to resolve the corresponding problems, like problems coming from difficult relationships between different religious groups inside the crusade, and so on and so forth. Second important, I would even go as far as to say central dimension, is ethical. Wrath of the Righteous is based on the tabletop RPG Pathfinder, which in turn is inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. In all of those game systems, the deities and even the Lords of Demons are characterized, first of all, by their ethical teaching, however weird it can be. And it is almost always presented around the Abrahamic Judeo-Christian idea of sin. Any deity and even any demon lord provides his or her followers with some sort of philosophy on what is, okay, good is not the word, on what are you supposed to do and what are you supposed not to do, and punishes them for any transgressions against this teaching. Wrath of the Righteous is no exception to this general system of Dungeons and Dragons religious groups. Throughout the game, we're introduced to the teaching of each of the K gods and demon lords, and even to some extra ones. In fact, description of most of the gods start with description of their philosophy. And ethical dilemmas in this game, a popular feature in the RPG genre in general, often have, among other things, a religious component. Most importantly, ethical and social dimensions of religion in Rise of the Righteous are often mixed up to a complete merging. Each deity implies or even directly postulates its preferred form of social organization and individual, personal ideal of behavior, and those two must contribute to each other. Other dimensions are either absent or act as something secondary to those first. There's particularly no doctrinal dimensions aside from general occult natural philosophy-ish idea of existence of the soul and its posthumous fate. The material dimension is represented by several artifacts like banners called Sword of Valor or sword called Radiance. Some of those artifacts have corresponding dialogues hinting at their religious significance, but nothing more. More importantly, there are no routine actions around material elements of religion. Any important from religious point of view material object is something unique, and there are no practice of venerating them. Likewise, separate dialogues with members of the protagonist party and other NPCs imply the emotional dimension of religion, like the need to cultivate a specific emotional state, but nothing besides that, and it's extremely optional. And for example, Sila, one of the protagonist's companions, Paladin, you can see her here, joined her order for purely ethical reasons. She does not describe her experience in terms of, for example, a religious calling or any other emotional need. She decided it was the right thing to do to train as a Paladin. The mythological dimension or narrative dimension is in a complicated position. At first glance, the player is confronted and even participates in narratives that have something to do with the religious sphere, the battles between angels and demons, the appearance of the gods in the mortal world, and their powerful servants, etc., etc., etc. But those stories are presented as a historical chronicle and are not surrounded by any special significance, with the sole exception of the story about how Baphomet stole a big devilish labyrinth from devil lord Asmodeus, whatever. There is one purely religious narrative which possesses the religious importance, but it is a single one. On the one hand, it may be tempting to say that this situation arises from fantasy setting of the game, in which the existence of gods is an immutable fact, and therefore any description of their action would be something akin to a historical chronicle. But for many religious people, mythological narrative in the real world serve as an objective description of events that for them actually happened in the past. But this does not prevent them from endowing those stories with a special religious meaning, differentiating them from secular historical chronicle. And this highlights the strange position of the ritual dimension in Rise of the Righteous, closely related to mythological dimension in most of the real religions, real world religions, I mean. On the one hand, the player is regularly reminded of this side of religion by both cultists and some of his own companions, in particular the elf Ember, who prays for the redemption of the demon lords. But the player has practically no opportunity to interact with ritual dimension, and the surrounding rituals act mostly as a secondary elements of more important religious dimension. For example, participation in the sacrifice serve as an initiation rite for a cultist, while Ember's prayers are a manifestation of her ethics. As we may see, in Rest of the Righteous, religion is, first of all, a set of instructions sent by God or demon on how to organize your society and your personal life. While this is a valid optics for some religion in the real world, it is very problematic in case of others. But, and this is actually the most important part of my talk, this approach can be found in almost all AAA projects, at least Western AAA projects that somehow deal with the subject of religion, and naturally in many smaller games. And for this reason, I would like to close my presentation with a mention, simply mention, like half a minute, of a game King of Dragon Past, which is also based upon tabletop RPG, in this case Rune Quest or Hero Quest. Developers of this game try to emulate a culture and mentality of pre-Christian society, roughly similar to real-world Bronze Age. And one important thing they did for that purpose was the organization of this fictional religion around mythological, ritual, and material dimensions, often neglected in video games. Thank you very much. I would be very glad to answer questions, since it will at least signify that you are able to understand what I'm talking.
Yes, thank you, Nick, for your talk. Does somebody have questions to Leonid right now? So if not, yeah, Lars, please.
Leonid, thanks for the presentation. I have a question about the 7 dimensions of religiosity, right? And my question is just going to be, how many of these can we actually apply to the object of Pathfinder itself, right? The sets of rules, because it seems like it has a lot of ritual properties, and it seems like, you know, it's very clearly it has like a narrative, as you said. It's very difficult to set a difference in status between myth as like historical fact or somehow different than other fictions. It's a cultural object that people, you know, in different ways, I'm including also Pathfinder as just a rule set, right, outside of this game. People have put like a lot of worth into this. And then, you know, I've had deeply emotional experiences with Pathfinder games and similar games. So my question is just, without being rhetorical or whatever, like, what's stopping us from making Pathfinder itself into a religious object and just like taking this fictional text at face value, just as other people do with, you know, Scientology or the Bible or whatever, and making a religion out of it? Can we do that, or is there some vital difference that I'm missing in your analysis?
Can we make a religion out of tabletop RPG? Well, I guess yes, we can. The American society was obsessed with the fear of that for many years. Just to be clear, since I had only 15 minutes, I wasn't able to clarify that I obviously was talking about simulating of those spheres in case of video games. Sorry, I think I should have told that. What I meant is that, for example, by emotional sphere in this presentation, I meant not the emotions which game would cause in a player, but, for example, dialogue options and decisions which would simulate emotions experienced by your player character, whether those emotions corresponds or completely contradicts your own emotions is an important question, but a different one. I was talking only about things that happen on that side of the screen. In the same way, material dimension meant simulated material object inside the game. But can we apply this scheme provided by Ninian Smart to real-world tabletop RPG players? Well, I believe we can, theoretically. I mean, why would we? It can be somewhat productive, although I can see the doctrinal dimension may be, well, it would be somewhat problematic to connect, since doctrinal dimension implies, how can I say it without offending Alexei, hardcore philosophy, like teaching on what reality is, what matter is, and usually even very dedicated tabletop role players avoid those questions, at least as part of the game. But yes, we can. I mean, Smart himself applied his methodology, for example, to Maoism. And well, it is quite obviously easier by far to connect those schemes to any sort of totalitarian ideology, but I guess it is possible.
Just very briefly in support of, so I'm saying the argument works so well that it could turn back onto the object that it's describing, I think, extra diegetically. And people have kind of done that, right? So there are Tolkien religions and other religions kind of based on what was meant to be fiction, where apparently that works well, according to at least Marcus Davidson, because texts like Pathfinder, I want to say, and the texts by Tolkien and maybe Star Wars and other things have these theological affordances. They tick so many of the Ninian Smart boxes that it's a difficult question to answer, I think, like, why isn't this a religion? It's, you know, people lacking its following.
Well, first of all, well, yes, and it somewhat calls to argument you were discussing about where is the God now, but well, again, I haven't done a lot of sociological research in my life in general. I'm too shy, but in my like common sense experience, I wouldn't describe religion of Tolkienist people, at least in Russia, as something directly derivative from Tolkien's books. They use books by Tolkien, but so are some Catholics, for example. I mean, Tolkien is a great way to introduce a person to Catholic teachings. And they, for example, create a lot of texts themselves, and those texts can sometime, at least in Russia, I don't know the situation in the West, be as influential as Lord of the Rings, for example. And they, for example, they argue with Tolkien very often precisely from those religious standpoint, because they believe that they somehow perceive Middle Earth better than Tolkien did, since Tolkien was a Catholic and they are not. They are Valar followers. But still, yes, it is great observation. Thank you. I'm a bit nervous about it.
Yeah, so does somebody else have questions to Leonid right now? After Lars. Yeah, I also wanted to ask you a question, Leonid. Did I get it correctly that you mean that basically video games are paying more attention to the rituals in general and to those aspects of the religion that were more important for the religions before Abrahamic context, so to say, and not those things that are more important in context of Abrahamic religions for Christianity and so on. And for this reason, it's a kind of more about, yeah, because I just got it so with the last slide, because maybe it was somehow maybe it was a misunderstanding, but the last slide strongly so to say, encouraged me to think so. I think that it was the point.
Can you repeat the first part of your question? Можешь по-русски, если...
Well, no, I think it would be better to say it in English. Did I understand it correctly that you mean that in video games, the aspects of rituals and of materialist aspects of games are represented more vividly and
no. Ethical and social dimensions are presented as a default way to represent religion. Religion in video games is a description by God or prophet and so on how to live your life. King of Dragon Pass is an exception to this logic, since it presented a religion, first of all, as a conglomerate of rituals and stories, without any coherent and universal ethics. There are ethical consideration in the fictional religion presented in King of Dragon Pass, but they are secondary. I'm talking now about King of Dragon Pass, and Pathfinder is a typical example of the way religion is represented around social and ethical dimensions, in the same way as the religion is represented, I don't know, in Bioshock Infinite or Far Cry 5 or Dragon Age, basically, where religion is, first of all, an answer to the question, how should we live our life and how should we force those guys to live their lives? The religious guys are usually the bad guys in those games.
So, and Pathfinder is special because it gives more attention to
Pathfinder is not special. Oh, shit. I think I need to work on my English. Pathfinder is not special. Pathfinder is a typical example. That is precisely my point. I tried, maybe unsuccessfully, to use Pathfinder as an example of a typical situation, which repeats itself again and again across different genres, from global strategies by paradox, where religion is, first of all, simulated through the way your society should be organized according to this religion, to RPGs and AAA shooter games, where unique religious ethics is a reason for conflict. Typically.
Okay. So that, no, it's totally fine about your English. I'm sorry. It's just a little bit difficult to drift between those two options of moderating and participating.
I can relate.
So thank you for your answers. Now, well, we actually ran out of time, but yeah, if Lars and Pavel Inozemtsov and Roman Voronin still have, all three of them still have some energy, we can still continue for just about 10 minutes to talk about the questions that were left that they have, that Pavel and Voronin have had to the talk made by Lars. Fine. Okay. So then, Pavel, are you still here?
I think my questions are so big, so I will text to Lars my questions. It's okay by mail.
Okay, great. And then Roman, how do you?
Okay, thank you for the talk, Lars. By the way, it was really thought-provoking, and actually it's good that you and Leonid were talking about Tolkien, because this is partially is what my question is about. Have you read Michael Saller's book As If, Modern Enchantment and the Literary Prehistory of Virtual Reality? The title is in the chat. Because, I mean, this book is about a lot of things. It's mostly about sociology of literature and history, but essentially he touches a question which you were talking about in a way, this phenomenon of what if discussions and this phenomenon of empirically detailed world making, where and when recipients of usually mass cultural products theorize and colonize imaginary worlds as if they were real and as if they could be rationally researched and empirically researched and like empirically debated. So the whole trend actually reminds of theology debates in a way. This corresponds to some examples from your research. So could pop theology, which you insisted on, be part of that trend actually? Is it any different from, for example, among religious players? Is it not? So this is my question. I hope it makes sense.
I think there's a bunch of things to disentangle there, but the way I understood it in part is like, if people take seriously any what if text, then what's the difference? But again, I'm going to return this question to you to see if I understood it well. Like, is there a difference between taking seriously the what if of like a clearly fictional text versus the what if of texts that are seen as sacred, or do I misunderstand the question entirely?
No. You have this slide of pop theology where you say that some people are talking about religious things in games and just religion representations in games, and they are debating it or maybe debunking it. It doesn't matter. They are just talking about it as if it were real, as if it were their real experience, right? So this is actually what this researcher is talking about. Like, we can research, like we can discuss some things, some fictional universes. He gives some examples as Tolkien, Sherlock Holmes, Lovecraft, whatever, it doesn't matter. Just we know what he means. As if they are real, like we can research them. And just religion and religious representation in games is just a part of that bigger trend. So it's not just pop theology as a unique phenomenon. It's just a little thing in the whole complex system of mass culture.
I think there's a fundamental difference between the way that people read sacred texts, though, and other texts. So yes, they discuss these seriously, but for most players, regardless of their religious background and whatever, it's clear that they are talking about a fictional text that prompted them in a specific way. I hope you can't hear me, Kat.
We can. Hello, Kat.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
And so there's even a large group of people in those discussions that I call pop theology, because they are talking about the status of certain texts, the difference between clearly fictional, perhaps trivial texts, and texts that other people hold sacred, as, you know, according to some different or not. They're taking all these classically theological questions, first of all, prompted by popular culture, and secondly, within, you know, an amateuristic content. That's why I call context. These are not trained theologians or literary scholars. And so that's why I call it pop theology. But I think there's a vital difference where there are very few people, and I don't take these as part of my analysis, right? there are very few people who take modern fictional texts as religious texts. What I mean by that is that there's very often a difference in attitudes of reading, right? So texts that are seen as fictional can maybe prompt certain things for people to reflect on in the real world, but usually they are read as, framed as fictional. And the vital difference with sacred texts is that they either metaphorically or historically directly say something about the real world and even the metaphysical. I think that's a vital difference. There is, of course, the niche of people that take fictional texts, such as the books by Tolkien, or possibly games, if they show enough handlebars to take and to make a religion out of, that people do read them as sacred texts themselves, but I haven't seen that, and that wasn't part of the theology analysis. Still not completely sure if I answered your question.
Well, in a way, but not totally. What I mean is, actually, maybe I misunderstood you. Do you mean by this pop theology thing that people, when they are discussing it in that framework, they are thinking rationally about all this fictional stuff? Because what this book is about is that people try to, well, actually the bigger trend is just rational research, and theology is a rational research in a way too. So this is why I asked that question.
They're mounting like rationalized, logical, theological arguments about fictional text. I think that's separate from the experience of being within a game and for that moment accepting that things are real. But these discussions were definitely mostly framed as critically alienated. I'm sorry, I'm so distracted. But so I do think I understand the question. And yeah, it's different because they're not talking about their experience while playing the game, but they're reflecting on it afterwards in public with people who disagree with them. And that discussion is, I think, inherently theological in the sense that they're making rational discussions about the truth status of those texts in comparison to what other people see as sacred texts or ultimate meaning generating beliefs.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I got it. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Roman. And Leonid, you raised your hand. You wanted to.
Well, if I can ask a question to Lars.
Yeah, I guess so, if Lars doesn't mind.
Oh, please, yeah, please.
Yeah, it is a follow-up to my question about appropriation between mean and make. And what I'm curious as to, are there any educated, among this pop theology, are there any sort of educated in the sense of video game educated critique of a particular video game from religious standpoint? I mean, we all know a lot about uneducated critique of video games from religious standpoint, like their violence, boo-hoo, whatever. But I mean, is there actually players who completed video games and they said basically something like, okay, this video games is good, but according to my pop theological, as you called it, reasoning, it contradicts my religion. Not in the sense that I'm going to kill someone right now, but still there are some claims there that are not in accordance to my religion. Thank you.
Yeah, there are large groups of these. This is so I call the type of conversation in general that I gathered from video game forums. So these are all in the first case players where they talk about religion prompted by a game, and I saw basically 4 positions there, and one of them is the one you described there, which is people who reject games entirely because they do not agree with their so. Either sometimes they do play them, but then they're like, okay, you have to see this separate. So I interviewed a Muslim player was like, well, all of these games are technically haram, and some of them I can't play unless I really frame it as like, oh, it's just like some frivolous bad thing. But there were a lot of players that just didn't play certain games because they didn't agree with their worldview. There's a notorious example of the BioShock player, right, who got his money back because he refused to be baptized. And that is, pretty early on in the game, a way to start the game, BioShock Infinity. And so they didn't play it. Other groups were more or less overlapping, but these are ideal types, right? Where people would just debunk the trivia, so debunk the status. It's like they might be religious or they might not be, but it doesn't matter. Games are fictional, trivial things that you just play for fun. They're not on the same status as beliefs in religion and all these important things, so we can just forget about them. And then the other two groups either completely went into debate, mostly to prove their own, to prove how they found their own existing religious convictions in those texts, very often by using like very in-depth knowledge of both the games and of religions. And a final group really connected with other ways of viewing the world, sometimes leading to conversion. And largely from that did I select people for additional interviews, because I thought that was so fascinating. But so to answer your question, yeah, there were a lot of people who just didn't agree with what was seen in the game and rejected that kind of meaning entirely. You wanted to say something, please?
Thank you.
So I think that's it. I think we have already been talking for more than 2 hours. I think we all were tired of it. I still have 3 more questions to Lars that I haven't asked, but I think I am tired also, and Oli already went to sleep because, well, he, as I remember, he's in China and it is almost deep night right now. And for me, I'm also in Tübingen, which means that it's later than, for example, in Moscow. And well, I think I guess it's possible for all of us to communicate in our, first of all, in our Facebook group. Maybe, please, Lars, send me your slides in PDF or in PPT as you wish. And if you don't mind, I will post it in our Facebook group. Yeah. And also, I wanted to say that this link to Zoom that we use today will be the permanent link for all of our conferences that we will have in the future. So please save it and use it. I will also post it in the Facebook, but nevertheless. So, and please, maybe Lars, and if you don't mind, maybe you could also type in right here your email that we could, or maybe, don't you mind if we, if all the participants send you personal messages in Facebook? It's totally fine. Or what would be more convenient for you? How to communicate?
You can. Everyone's more than free to email me. My email can be found by Googling my name. It's just I have a little bit of hesitance to type it in the chat because I think you, like, Zoom recordings have the chat as well, or is it not visible on the YouTube stream?
No. It's only us talking and in the presentation, but not the chat room itself.
Okay, if it's just not, well, either way, you can find my email by typing in my name. That's probably easiest.
Okay.
I'm available. I am on leave until January because I deserve a break, but I will get back to everyone that emails me.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you then Julia, Leonid, and Lars for those great talks. I hope you felt great. For me, it was a great conference as well as the last one. And anyway, thank you very much for the attention. If everything's fine, and if you don't have any important questions and so on, so then goodbye.